Hello and welcome back to ESPN Scrum Reset. It's Sam Bruce, joined as ever by Christy Doran after a brief little hiatus over the last fortnight as we prepared to welcome in the Rugby Championship. And Christy, we certainly welcomed it in incredible fashion this weekend. So many talking points in the lead up to the games, and then obviously a brilliant, really entertaining, let's call it 6 or 7 hours of Test match rugby this morning, early our time. I must admit I didn't do the double header, but when the alarm went off at 5 a.m. for the Wallabies and Pumas, I was certainly ready for some footy, if paying the price this afternoon after a pretty busy day. Mate, hello to you. Thanks for joining us again. I guess to kick us off, we'll come to the Michael Hooper stuff in a little while. But your immediate reflections on that Wallabies performance today.
Oh, look, I wrote a couple of, I feel like I've been writing all day, and that's because there's so much to talk about, and you're right, and welcome back to you. You look fresh as a daisy after your trip to Fiji, I think it was.
Beautiful spot. Did
you run into Scott Robertson there?
Didn't see Scott, but I must say I managed to bring on another listener, our driver, Sefa, actually. Same name as Sefa Naivalu, who, yes, once I told him what I did, he was intrigued and talked the whole way, and the wife just sat there pretty quietly thereafter for the rest of the trip to the Marriott at Momi Bay. But yeah, big shout out to Sefa. Hope you're listening, mate.
Shout out to Sefa indeed. Oh, look, a couple of things stood out, and first of all, one thing that you can say about Dave Rennie's sides is that they're showing character, and those staying in the fight, staying in the battle, has been on display. I would say I can't think of a single test thus far under Rennie's 2.5-year tenure. And I think of a blowout in Sydney where the All Blacks were leading about 30-0 before a try to Noah Lolesio, but they still actually fought right the way through. And those shining characteristics are really coming to the fore now because, 3 tests against England, they managed to fight their way back. We saw it against France last year in the July series. We saw it against South Africa. And even in those couple of tests against Wales and England and Scotland last year, where they weren't clinical necessarily, but they showed the fighting characteristics that allow you to stay in the hunt. We didn't necessarily always see that with Michael Cheika coach sides. They seemed like they were very temperamental, and a bit like the characteristic of Michael Cheika, which was up and down. And when things went pear-shaped, so did the team. Fortunately, this side seems like they're pretty rock solid under Dave Rennie. The polish isn't always there. And when I think of that, I think of the Hunter Paisami grubber under advantage, which goes too long to Len Ikitau. Now, we've seen that a few times with Hunter, and it's a good option, but the execution isn't quite there yet. Once those sorts of things start to come into effect, we'll see a side which actually takes their opportunities, and they'll be a side that you would imagine in the semi-finals of a World Cup next year. But 3 years into this 4-year project, and potentially a 7 to 8 year project, considering the rebuilding mission that needed to take place, they're getting there. What I liked about the test more than anything was that this side doesn't necessarily think that they're world beaters yet. They're not. But what they do have is a good pack, and they've got a really emerging forward pack. They've got Dan McKellar there, who's brought the strengths of the Brumbies into the Wallabies, which are turning into a strength which every test team needs to have, and that is a strong forward pack that can lay the platform and be rock solid at the set piece, and at times dismantle an opposition via that mechanism. And we saw that with the rolling maul. People might not like it, but it is damn effective. And you've got to be a test powerhouse nation, you've got to be good in that area. They've scored 3 tries there. We saw a scrum when they were going backwards or losing struggle. They managed to work their way through that. And the line out with Folau Fainga'a was excellent. The 2 players that I've highlighted are Folau Fainga'a and Darcy Swain, who I thought had both their best 2 tests, and we can look at specific moments. The rolling maul, stopping that twice from Darcy Swain, getting on the ball. I think it was in the 17th minute or just before that, rather. Swain gets on the ball. We saw, the beautiful deft pass to Quade Cooper, which puts him to space. So they're the pleasing elements, because without a forward pack, you don't win test matches.
Absolutely right. 3 of the 5 tries, of course, came from the rolling maul. One finished by Fraser McWright getting pulled across the line by Jed Holloway, who had a very solid game, I thought, on debut, and a real emotional post-match little interview with Stan Sport. If you haven't seen that, if you flicked off at full time to go and get a coffee, go back and watch that, because despite a cheeky little F-bomb, it was beautiful to see the emotion and what that international debut meant to him. And then, of course, penalty try from Mike Adamson, who is a referee. I tell you what, if I'm a coach at the World Cup next year and I'm seeing Mike Adamson next to one of my team's fixtures from the knockout phase onwards, I'm a little bit concerned, because it's helter-skelter stuff to me. And to me, it feels like he's still reffing as if it's a sevens game. And I think we mentioned that following the Wales test last year. It was 30 penalties in total. The first half never really had any flow to it at all. He was very quick on the whistle. The Wallabies were 10-3 behind in the count at half time. But then in the second half, it all flipped around. And at one stage, there must have been about 8, 9, 10 penalties that Australia had in a row. So,
but before we move on, look, we don't want to talk too much about the referee.
No, absolutely not.
But I actually, it was pedantic. That's what it was. And it was nitpicking. And you could find more penalties in there. But unfortunately, that's the game of rugby that it is now. I actually thought the vast majority of them he kind of got right. I thought the Jed Holloway one, where he's gone slightly across, but he's managed to get hands firmly on the ball. I thought that's wrong. He's got hands on the ball. He's probably won it. He's come down with the ball.
Yeah.
I thought that was a mistake. But for the vast majority of them, I thought they were pretty right. I think on the whole, he largely stayed away from the pocket. Holloway, maybe other referees might have given him a yellow card for a high tackle there. There was when all the penalties were going against the Wallabies in that first half. So it was interesting that I think it might have been Morgan Terenui very early on said that Mike Adamson generally early in a test match goes very hard at it, and then we'll start to let it go a little bit more. Well, we saw that with the Wallabies, certainly, but some of the things that the Argentinians were doing in that second half was what Australian supporters had been furious about for years under Michael Cheika, an ill-disciplined side. And we saw some simple things off the back of kick restarts where the Pumas just gave penalties away and allowed the Wallabies to picky way their back up the half of the field. So I wasn't as frustrated as some, but I could understand Andrew Merton's bemoaning the style that Mike was going about it.
Yeah, and clearly, as you say, we don't want to harp on about it, and we need referees coming through at the elite level, and no doubt he's going to get better as he gets more exposure. But certainly there's, and I mean, that's the thing too, coaches they do so much research into the opposition team. Yeah. They must research the referee as well and work out what are their particular focal points and where do they usually award the majority of their penalties.
Yeah, indeed. And the other one that I'd highlight is the Hunter Paisami. He clearly went for an intercept there, almost got 2 hands on it. I don't think he necessarily did, but you know what? Mike Adamson there goes, that was a genuine intercept.
Yep. Good call.
And I don't think we saw the TMO really come into it at all, once or twice around tries and whether or not they were, and they were legitimate. Do we check this? They played on. I thought the TMO, or the lack of TMO interjections, was incredibly refreshing, and perhaps that's why I think the balance was reasonably well struck, because despite the fact that there was a number of penalties, we didn't have the stop-start nature of a TMO.
Very good. All right. It's such a big talking point. Let's start with Quade Cooper before we come to skipper Michael Hooper. The second half injury on the back of course, the calf injury there in the warm-up over in Perth. It just looked straight away like an Achilles, didn't it? Just the fashion in which it happened. Quade had a really threatening first half. The break you mentioned off the Swain pass, just couldn't find Fraser McWright there in support. There was some good Argentine cover coming across. Perhaps a little bit of the old Quade there in the first minute with a flick pass to an unsuspecting Len Ikitau. But on the whole, he looked to be playing pretty well with
sharp.
Quade.
He looked sharp.
10. He did look sharp. And then to see him drifting across there, a beautiful delayed pass for Patai's try there after the Wallabies had been under the pump early. Just there early in the second half, drifting across, nothing, a little bit of a stutter step, and the next thing, he's gone down. The old sniper's got him. Terrible to see, given what he'd been through, obviously, with the calf injury that ruled him out from the England series. And that's certainly going to be a lengthy stint on the sidelines. And I think, as we've both written today, it's really thrown the World Cup, his ambition to play the third World Cup, which on the strength of his first half performance today, you'd think he was very much tracking towards. It's going to be a tough assignment now, isn't it?
Absolutely. I had a few Wallabies, not so long retired Wallabies messaging me going, is it an Achilles? Because they were all obviously pretty anxious. Some of them mates with him, some of them know him very well.
Yep.
Like a bitter, devastating blow. Like, this is a 12-month injury, and at his age, players might not ever recover to their speed. And at his age, it's very unlikely that he ever will. But particularly given that 12 months brings him on to the eve of the World Cup, and he's the sort of guy that is shown that he doesn't necessarily need match form or match practice to come into a game, because what we saw today was good enough to be a Test standard. And what we saw last year, when he had been in the wilderness for 4 years of Test and hadn't played a game of professional rugby in the Division 2 of Japan, we hadn't seen. He delivered against the Springboks too. So, if he can somehow get himself to a state where he can run and match some speeds, you wouldn't rule him out. But long way back, and this is I've been saying it for a long time. Those that have been listening to the podcast would have heard me go, I don't see both he and James O'Connor making it to the World Cup. And I've been saying it for a long time, and I still feel like both of them might not make it to the World Cup. Maybe one is already gone. We know that James O'Connor can't really string 3 to 4 games together at the moment. And sometimes that's also because he's not getting picked. But what does that do? And then in terms of an experience decision, do you bring in a second youngster to kind of learn?
Tane Edmed and Ben Donaldson are now potentially one injury away from a call-up, and you've got to think that at least one of them will be going to Europe later in the year and could see some action even before then.
Yeah, look, I'm a Ben Donaldson. Out of the two, I'm a Ben Donaldson fan. I think Ben Donaldson's got more of a Test game. I've spoken to recently a few people that go, do you think Ben could do a job? And they still think it'd be rushing him, which is interesting. They've got to make a really clear decision next year, the Waratahs, who they pick at 10. They've got Kurtley Beale coming back. One of them will have to be sacrificed probably to the bench. Injuries will occur, no doubt. I think that Noah Lolosio should be part of most 23s going forward, simply on the fact that I think he'll play a pivotal role at next year's World Cup. Whether or not he starts, whether or not he comes off the bench, or whether or not he starts later in a tournament, should they progress deep in it, just given the history of O'Connor and Quade. One name that I floated in a story today, and I know for a fact that he's interested, is Bernard Foley. And there's going to be a lot of people that will raise their eyebrows, go, come on, seriously, what are you on about? And this probably stems to the fact that under Checker, the Wallabies in 2017, 18, 19 weren't particularly flash hot, and they particularly weren't flash hot in 2019, nor were the Waratahs. But you look at when Foley was used, and he was used against the Springboks in South Africa, not used again until the World Cup against Wales, thrown in the deep end there after not even being picked for the first Test against Fiji in the World Cup, has a shocker, and there's no doubt about it. But one or two bad games doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad player. He's gone to Japan a couple of years away, has had a good time. And in fact, he was asked before Quade Cooper, are you interested in joining the Wallabies last year before the Rugby Championship? And look, there's particular players out there that feel like they were either burnt from Rugby Australia or because there was no communication from Rugby Australia for a couple of years, guys that have played 70 tests, that do they, how does it make them feel when you just at the last minute go, oh, do you want to come train with us and see how you're going? Like, you've got to treat some guys with more respect, particularly when they've been at World Cups, particularly when they've been a part of a group for so long. So I wouldn't rule it out. There's going to be a third Giddo pick at some point in time, because we know that Karevi's out for a long time and we know that Quade's out for a long time. It allows Rory Arnold to come into this spot seamlessly. So Marika will stay there. Is there a third option? I don't think they'll go to a Bernard Foley at the moment, but there is a massive gap between fly halves, playmakers, between the age group of 23 to 30. And they're the shortcomings of Rugby Australia, that they haven't been able to have one player who is in the test reckoning between 23 and 30, which is staggering.
Yes, I actually interviewed Bernie earlier in the year, so I've just picked it up again for ESPN here now, and just reading something, a few of his quotes back there. There is always the carrot to play in the Wallabies jersey and to play in World Cups as the pinnacle. So that's always at the back of your mind. So he certainly hasn't ruled it out by any stretch. As you say, there's probably a couple ahead of him for now, and it would be a move towards experience rather than looking to generation next or certainly incoming, but not completely beyond the realms of possibility.
Sam, before we move on from a 10 situation, we'll talk about who should play 10 next week. But before that, if it's a World Cup final in a month's time or in 2 months' time, and hypothetically there's no James O'Connor because he's injured or he's in and out of injury and you're not quite sure, Quade's not there and it's Noah, sure, you take him. But would you prefer a Ben Donaldson who's not played a match, or would you prefer a Bernard Foley who's got 70 tests of experience, who's had a really good year, guided a pretty poor roster in Japan to the semi-finals, where, let's be honest, there's 4 or 5 really good teams now in the Japanese League One comp?
Look, you'd seriously consider it. And I think as you make the point there that Donaldson and Edmed are just scratching the start of their careers, really. A bit of exposure with Australia A, obviously recently in the Pacific Nations Cup. But to be honest, if it was next month or 6 weeks, you would certainly have to look seriously at him. The experience, particularly as you mentioned there with James O'Connor, seemingly out of sorts since his return there off the bench against England. I'm sure we're going to see James again this season. I have no doubt about that. And if he can get his body right and really, potentially now link up with Hunter Paisami, who, as you mentioned, had a really strong game there back at number 12, which is, far more suited to, in my opinion, than 13. He looks really sharp. That combination we spoken about beforehand with James at number 10 and a couple of other Reds potentially in the backs, Geordie Bataille back on the wing, and a guy you wanted to flag, Tom Wright, looking right at home at fullback. So, look, it's an intriguing proposition, isn't it? And we'll just have to see how the next few weeks unfold. I mean, the Wallabies injury ward, just when you think it can't get any worse, when you lose Samu Karevi on Commonwealth Games duty, and I don't know how much we want to unpack that decision. I mean, hindsight's a beautiful thing, but certainly in a World Cup year, had the Com Games been held and the World Cup, as you said, were in September, then there'd be no way Samu would have gone to the Com Games in that position. But compare Dave Parecki, Cop's concussion at the start of the week after the rotten run of luck, both in the lead up to the England series and then what went on during that 3-test showdown. It's quite remarkable, really.
Yeah, you're not wrong. And look, it's attritional, and we've always known that. But at the moment, there's a lot of injuries. There's a lot of questions being asked, and there's a lot of, not just questions from Joe Blow or people in the media. There is some heat from questions around rugby administrations going, what's going on in here? There's been a lot of injuries, and some of them on the training paddock, particularly, which isn't great. Who are you starting next week at number 10?
I'm starting Noah Lolesy. I don't think he was particularly bad at all in against England. Obviously, as we spoke about after the third test, the Wallabies got very lateral. They seemed determined to try and spin the ball from side to side. I mean, he's still finding his voice, really, isn't he? And that's potentially the big learning that came out of that, he really needs to step up and command that, hang on, boys, this isn't working, or it's not getting the desired outcomes that we're after. We've got to change tune here a little bit. And that's all part of his development. And but he'd be where I'd go next week for sure. What about you?
Yeah, I think it might depend on there's been a few changes already, and you don't want to be making changes and multiple changes week to week. You want players to allow to build into it as well. We're not across in Argentina at the moment, so it's hard to know how they are going training wise, etc., etc. I probably would start Noah. I agree. I didn't think he had a particularly. I thought he had a reasonable series against England, particularly standing up against England in Perth. I probably would return to a 5-3 split, and I would allow James O'Connor to go on the bench. I think Reece can hold his spot potentially on the bench, and I think that would be fair enough given his contribution to the game on the weekend.
And the coverage that he provides from 10 through 15, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And look, maybe on the other hand, you go, well, Reece can play backup, and you go as Sully Vunivalu. But if you're putting a Sully Vunivalu on the bench, I don't want to see him just for 3 minutes. There's very little giving him token minutes like that. The expectation around that, in my opinion, should be if you're going to go to Sully Vunivalu, you play him. You play him for 20, 25 minutes, and you let him go. You've got to learn. You don't learn from sitting on the sidelines. It'd be slightly, there's no way that they would just allow James O'Connor to sit on the sidelines and give him 3 minutes. Or I say that, but Dave Rennie didn't give him huge minutes during last year's rugby championship either, when he did come back from injury, but he was still getting 15 to 20. And that's important to identify. So, it's a decision to make. That being said, the Wallabies bench was outstanding against Argentina. Nick Frost was brilliant. He is just going from strength to strength, and we see his pace.
Gut busting chase there at the finish, wasn't there?
Yeah, and clearly Hodge played well. I think it showed his shortcomings where his body shape was with the forward pass to Marika. But on the whole, Pete Samu, we know that he offers off the bench too, and Robbie only got a couple of minutes, so it's hard to kind of see there. But I thought that the bench and the forward pack, what they offered off the bench, was outstanding.
Of course, some massive news we awoke to on Saturday morning, Christy. Michael Hooper returning home with struggling, just freely admitting that he's doing it tough at the moment, not in the right mindset to play rugby at all. Some personal issues going on in his world at the moment. He withdrew as a result. My immediate reaction, I'm not sure about you, I wasn't shocked that this had come up. When I reflect on the past few years and some of the, I guess, the pressure, the situations that Hooper has been involved in, the leadership that he has had to show. Obviously, we think about the Israel Folau saga. We think about the onset of coronavirus and Rugby Australia needing to make sweeping pay cuts across the board, and that included the players, and Hooper was at the front of that. He's had to bear an incredible load, and now we find, he's a guy who never shirks any responsibilities. He fronts up to every media conference he's required to do. And just reflecting now, seeing him in Sydney after that loss to England, as beaten up as ever. When I saw on social media that had happened yesterday morning, I must admit I wasn't shocked at all.
Yeah, and I think the initial reaction was, this is interesting because it's 24 hours before the test. Like we heard today, Fraser McWright revealing that it was on the Friday morning that he gets told, okay, don't go to the gym, your hoops is crook. So clearly the team at that point in time hadn't been told, and this is Friday captain's run, that Hoops is withdrawing. So it's a last minute, very late in the piece decision. So like everyone, you're surprised more than anything. And his former teammates and players and mates, I think everyone was caught by surprise. What I found interesting was the release, the press release that came from it, and it was great that there was comments from both Wallabies captain Hooper to the coach to the CEO Andy Marinos, and a mindset issue was one of the things that was spoken about. And then there was a few of us that jumped on a presser with Dave, which was generous of their time to try to explain the situation a bit, but we didn't necessarily get to the bottom of what's going on. And you can understand that, because it seemed like the language that Dave Rennie was using was that, that for men particularly, to say that they're not okay, and we've got to be sensitive about this. The language that was, it seemed to me like it was more of a mental health thing. From my understanding since, and I've written about it this evening, that it's more of a physical toll that Michael has experienced. And, looking back at some of the stats today, 121 tests, the quickest ever to 100 tests. Of the 121 tests, he started 115 times. And of that, 95 times, he's gone 80 minutes. He's the second youngest Wallabies captain of all time. Made captain under 3 different coaches, and a 4th gave him in his debut. This is a guy that has shouldered so much. And recently, and even a conversation with him a couple of months ago at the front of an opera house for the announcement that Australia had secured the World Cup rights. It was the second week of Hoops missing a Super Rugby match because of concussion, and he said, "Look, I asked him how you're going and so forth, and he said, look, Sundays aren't as easy now. You once upon a time you could bounce up and you could be all right and you'd go for a surf and everything's all good. These days it seems like it's wearing on him." Now, speaking to a few people over the last 24 hours, they seem to think it's more of a taxing physical wearing down of him. And even the lead up to the Brisbane test, which I think was one of his worst games, he had the flu all week, pretty much, and was sick, wasn't in great shape apparently. And then even leading into the Sydney test, had a bit of a dodgy back. And if it wasn't a deciding test, if it wasn't on home soil, wasn't at the SCG, maybe he wouldn't have played that match. But there's also other questions that people are asking. Why isn't Fraser McWright being afforded more opportunities? And you look at someone like Fraser today, and he had a pretty good game. And, is there a hell of a lot of difference between him and Michael Hooper at the moment? Maybe in terms of a leadership perspective and a physical perspective in defence, but some of the attributes that Fraser's had and had for a long while, his link play, his ability to get on the ball, outstanding. Is there a need to just manage players a little bit better and maybe take a leaf out of the book out of Leinster, where Johnny Sexton hardly plays a game for Leinster, plays some of the big games, and they just make sure that physically and mentally he's always right to go?
Well, it's created an interesting scenario now, hasn't it? And we spoke about the Fraser McWright situation early on in the season when he was playing the house down for the Reds in the Australian portion of Super Rugby Pacific. He probably came back to the pack a little bit when contesting the Kiwi games for the Reds later in the season. But he's now got that opportunity, as you said, played pretty well today, obviously scored a try, but that's a minor thing. He was busy around the breakdown. He conceded an early penalty, but he didn't let that derail his want or desire to get on the ball. His support was always there. As we said, he loomed up behind Quade there in the first half. He just couldn't find him. Was 11 for 11 tackles. I think made, the next best Wallaby was maybe 5 or 6. So got through a heap of defensive work as well. And, this is a scenario, admittedly, in no way would he have wanted his opportunity to come like this. He's a team man. He's a former Australian under-20s captain. And he's got leadership qualities clearly on his as well. So he's probably going to get a run of games now. Is there and I know you wrote about this after the England series, and it's it's long for the Michael Hooper, not haters out there, but guys who potentially aren't enamored with what he's done in the Wallabies jersey over the years. It was an opportunity for people to say, yep, I think the time has come for a change of voice, potentially, or no, Hooper is the man to go through to the World Cup. With this now obviously occurring, is it a time to look seriously at that and think, okay, perhaps James Slipper, who is also a man who's had his personal struggles in the past, and perhaps that's something for Hoops to call on and have a bit of a chat with Slips, and no doubt he will at some point, about finding his way back and getting through some personal stuff. Is that the option now, that to help manage him, as you say, to help manage Michael Hooper through to France next year, that he can potentially, that's the captaincy is one thing that he doesn't really need?
I think it's something that will seriously be considered. From my understanding, that has actually been raised to Wallabies officials in the past. Is there the possibility of a co-captain? From my understanding, they are not keen on that idea, and nor is there, and as I kind of wrote and posed, nor is there the obvious alternative candidate, which has made it trickier, particularly when you look at Alan Alatoa and Taniela Tupou, James Slipper and Angus Bell.
Well, it's really only Nick White, isn't it, that could potentially step in and do that. And we know Nick is not a great, perhaps, referee manager, like any good halfback, right? They're going to have their run-ins with the whistleblowers.
Look, I think that you could see Michael Hooper continue with the on-field captaincy and perhaps take a really back step when it comes to, and it's not just fronting the media when you're the captain. There's a lot more functions, obligations to talk. There is the captain's run, generally speaking, or facing up after a Saturday after a win or a defeat. And how hard must it be when we can't deny it. It's a pretty poor winning percentage rate, and that's not necessarily a reflection of Michael Hooper, but a reflection of the times that he's unfortunately, or fortunately, led the Wallabies side. Dave Rennie going into the test had a 39% win rate as coach. That would have been, bumped up just a little bit now after that win yesterday's, or today's rather. So yeah, I think it will be a conversation that will be had. I think it will be entirely up to Michael Hooper. I don't expect Michael Hooper to play against the Springboks. I think he's a chance of playing against the All Blacks, but there is a strong chance that maybe he has the entire rugby championship off. But it's probably too early to tell, because I think Michael Hooper will probably take some time off, make sure he gets complete full physical examinations to see where he is physically, and he'll be also in tune mentally as well.
And like everyone in the Australian rugby community, and I'm sure the wider sporting community and everyone on the street, it's he's been lauded for taking this stance across the board. Really, it's a powerful message.
He has, yeah.
To all people out there, but particularly men of 18 to 70 or whatever, that we see the statistics of struggling and with various things in life. Bravo, Michael Hooper. Everyone wishing you well, and take as long as you need.
Hey guys, if you like this podcast and you like footy, why not join myself, Matt Walsh, Jake Michaels, and Champion Data's Christian Jolly as we break down all things footy with the help of the game's best statisticians. Get the ESPN Footy Podcast wherever you stream your podcasts every Tuesday.
That's a pretty good wrap on the Wallabies, Pumas, Christy. Now, there's obviously a fair bit going on across the ditch still. The other game in the Rugby Championship, of course, a few hours before the Wallabies win in Mendoza, was between the Springboks and All Blacks in Mbombela. 26-10 to the Springboks. Fairly comprehensive, and the heat just goes from, if he was already in the furnace, he's somehow found himself to the Earth's core and is surrounded by liquid hot magma. Now, Ian Foster, it's win this weekend or curtains, isn't it?
You'd think so, and that's some of the reports coming out of New Zealand, that's likely the case. And it was pretty telling that the New Zealand CEO, Mark Robertson, only said that he was the perfect man or he's the right man to lead the All Blacks to South Africa, but refused really to guarantee whether or not he'll be there at next year's World Cup. Now, that's like an open-ended question, and it's one which can be, a reporter's clearly trying to get an answer. Is he going to be there at the World Cup or not? And if he's not, then you hold people to account, don't you? So I felt like he's probably trapped between a rock and a hard place. But what it does show is that he's seriously under pressure, under scrutiny, already lost 2 of his assistants. A similar result, despite the fact that he's saying that, it was one of our better games. It was a step up, which is some of what Ian Foster's had to say since. The question is, he perhaps set up for failure. Going over to South Africa is an almighty tough task. Beating the world champions, they haven't played the All Blacks at home for a couple of years. Let's be honest, it was always going to be difficult to win one, let alone 2. So, look, I think it probably does come down to this test. It's just going to continue. It's a religion in rugby in New Zealand, isn't it? And if it's not, then it's just the hottest topic in town. It's all over the newspapers. It needs strong leadership. We haven't necessarily seen that, have we? And we've seen leaks coming out. We've seen emails. We've seen LinkedIn posts. It seems like an absolute schmozzle at the moment, what's happening over there. And maybe it's a fact that New Zealand haven't been used to losing and they don't know how to react. Maybe it's the arrogance. Maybe it's the contempt that New Zealand rugby's treated domestic or club rugby, pillaging in case or not financing it properly. Maybe it's the fact that they go ahead with private equity deals or try to have private equity deals with not talking to its stakeholders. There's a lot of things here, but as we've been talking about for a while now, you need to have that continuity and the cohesion and the between captain, coach, CEO. It doesn't seem like everyone's on the same page at the moment, and it's reflecting, I would say, on the field. The selections still raise eyebrows, look, like, what was your assessment coming out of that game? Like 26-10, a couple of really pivotal moments, a couple of really severe concussions to some of the playmakers of the game. There was a lot going on in the early hours anyway, Australian Eastern.
There was, and it's probably a good place to start. A nasty collision. Arenze, the winger, who I thought immediately was actually Cheslin Colby, and of course wasn't. Cheslin's got a broken jaw, but plays a lot like Cheslin, lighter frame, brilliant feet. He got through and challenged Beauden Barrett in the air late on. If you haven't seen it, it's a really frightening collision, and Bodie comes down and very nearly straight on his neck. Thankfully, it's more shoulder blades, shoulders and neck, but it could have been a catastrophic result for him. He gets a red card. Arenze's obviously red carded, as well. He stretched it off. But there was actually a challenge earlier in the match where I was surprised that he wasn't penalised for one on Geordie Barrett, where he chased through, he collected Geordie, not really in a position to catch the ball, and Geordie wasn't injured and didn't fall too badly. And Angus Gardner, who had a really good game otherwise, probably just erred in that one, I thought. And had that decision have been made, then perhaps Aronze, he might not have gone through with such vigour as he did to chase the box kicks, which we know is such a big part of the Springboks arsenal, that we might have avoided that clash. Now, thankfully, Bodie hasn't suffered any major injuries. You would think he might be at long odds to start next week, but we'll learn more in the coming days. Otherwise, Malcolm Marx just bossed the breakdown. I'm such a big Malcolm Marx fan, and I have been for years. I don't think there's probably anyone better over the ball than he is. He's got that frame. He's so low and so wide. And if he gets the chance to get on the ball, you're not going to get him off it. So a brilliant game from him. And yeah, I think the Springboks are probably trying to evolve their game a little bit. They showed some really nice moves in attack, managed to create an overlap a few times. Damien Allende went through and then kicked the ball out. But it was just a comprehensive win. I think, 26-10 probably
suffocated them, really.
They did. They squeezed them, and any opportunity, the rare opportunities that New Zealand did get, they often shot themselves in the foot. Bodie made a beautiful break from behind his own line and found Geordie, and then I think the play broke down with just a terrible forward pass from Akira Ioane. So yeah, look, they've got some massive issues, not just clearly within the game in New Zealand rugby and all the criticism that they've come in for in recent times, but there's real question marks in many positions across that team, and the heat, while it's on Ian Foster, it's certainly right on Sam Cane too. I do wonder if there was a coaching change, whether Sam Cane would be retaining his spot in the team. So hypothetically, if they were to lose next weekend, let's say Scott Robertson comes in, I wouldn't be shocked if Sam Cane isn't in the number 7 jersey for that first test against Argentina back in New Zealand.
Yeah, and look, he's not the only one, is he? It's at 10, it's at 15. It's another point that was really interesting around this was made by Justin Marshall when he probably wasn't having a couple of drinks, or maybe it was, but he made a really interesting point on radio where he said that the mana had been eradicated in recent years, and he spoke about the fact that they've lost against Argentina, they've lost against France, they've lost a home series, things that hadn't ever been done. Nations were sniffing the All Blacks, thinking this is our chance. Undoubtedly, the Wallabies are, and you can't speak too loudly because you don't want to spook them, or you don't want to waken the beast, because the Wallabies have been burnt so many times. But it was interesting hearing those comments, because for so long New Zealand has displayed a real confidence, inner confidence that they'll be all right. And you look across right now and you go, yes, they're missing a couple of those players, but belief's a big thing. And you just wonder whether or not the All Blacks have got the belief, and is the belief, is it a questioning of the coach? And if it's a questioning of the coach, it's really hard to bring back in. And I feel like that could be the case. I think Scott Robertson is the man. And we've been speaking about it for a long, long time. It'll be interesting to see if they go with Joe Schmidt, who's part of that system already. He could do a job. I absolutely have no doubt. I just wonder whether or not right time, right place. Scott Robertson's the sort of person that can go, well, this guy is a winner and he knows how to win. And he's got an unbelievable rapport with players, it seems. So, yeah, it'll be fascinating to see what happens over the next week. It's a big game. It's a big test match. They always are, New Zealand and South Africa. But hasn't it just... It shows the importance, I think, of South Africa, but this goes beyond Super Rugby and playing the SAFs, every second or third week. I think this is a New Zealand thing where we've seen for some time players like Rieko Ioane playing at 13. He's the best winger in the world potentially, but he wants to play in the midfield and he's allowed to. So much so that he was playing 12 for the Blues at times. Like, there's players there that, and I encourage you to look at a Rod Kafer column from 2020 where he spoke about some of these sorts of things around selection and around not getting necessarily too big for your boots. Look it up. And it was after the 16-all draw between the Wallabies and New Zealand in Wellington where Kafer warned players, Australians, don't get too confident, don't get too excited about what you've seen. This is a New Zealand side where there was a lot of poor selections. And players didn't play particularly well. So slight tangent, but really fascinating. And once we're talking about the Rugby Championship and how open it is, and this is why with the Wallabies, next week's pretty crucial, because if they win this in Argentina, 2 tests at home against South Africa, the second of which will be played at Sydney Football Stadium. Bumper crowd, imagine 40,000. You imagine Adelaide Oval will be pretty historic there. So there's a real opportunity here for some silverware to build some momentum,
and really win back a few more fans. As you say, those games. I think the one in Adelaide is actually an afternoon kickoff there at the Adelaide Oval, and of course Paddington and Moore Park will be humming for that first international event at Allianz Stadium. The turf's in, the Chooks and the Rabbits are going to kick it off in the NRL to officially open it, and then the Wallabies in box the next day. So a fantastic opening, and it should be a brilliant weekend of sporting action here in Sydney.
Oh, yeah. But before we go, Sam, did you catch the footage yesterday, Saturday, that is, of Joey's of schoolboy rugby?
I did, and a comment that was made to me was, how do we capture this and drive this? How do we really embrace this and make this? Why can't we get this kind of atmosphere at Waratahs games and everything? And there's different questions there and things about the way that sport is run. It was a big Catholic derby, of course, here in Sydney between View and Joey's, and a lot of reunions on, and that's why it was moved from Lane Cove to Leichhardt Oval. Certainly not a good sight seeing that railing come down and those what look like mostly gentlemen fall precariously forward. Really lucky, no serious injuries. It was confirmed this morning. But I'm sure we might hear Peter Volandis on 2GB referencing it and his quest to get a bit of funding for not just Leichhardt Oval, but a few other venues here in Sydney.
Oh yeah. It's not the last we've heard about that. The final one, and we haven't been on obviously about a week and a half, is you've got to pay a shout out to the Australian Seven sides and a great recovery, a great comeback after the disappointment a year ago in Tokyo. I thought Rugby Australia needed to be applauded with the high performance panel that made the decision, which was an unusual one, but a very simple one to switch the coaches over. And John Manenti's side, I thought, didn't take their chances against South Africa in the semi-final. They were there, but nonetheless, a reasonable result. And if they can jag a series victory or a tournament victory in the States over the next month, they could win the World Series. That's a huge one if they could do that. But particularly the women, Tim Walsh has clearly changed in aspects of his coaching, and speaking to Charlotte Caslick before that, and Tim himself said he was less narrow-minded as a coach. It was less coach kind of aspect and more listening and feeling how the players respond to various things. But Charlotte Caslick, we know that Maddie Levi is so impressive, and there's a lot of great young women playing the game. But Charlotte Caslick, that was that semi-final performance against New Zealand and even against Fiji in the final was one of the better performances I've seen in Australian rugby, men or women. Caslick over the ball, Caslick in defence, Caslick with ball in hand. She could teach a lot of people how to pass the ball left to right.
She's a brilliant footballer, full stop. And if you're naming the 20 best players in the world in sevens or 15, she's absolutely somewhere in that mix in the top 20 for mine. She's a fantastic athlete, a brilliant footballer. She's had a bit of exposure in the NRLW, and who knows, she may well end up back there after a third Olympics. But she's a great role model for Australian rugby and for Australian sport. Great to see. The girls have been across all mainstream media, back on Sports Sunday this morning. They've done a lot of, they understand their roles in the game and how important they are to it moving forward. Now they're going to push for a historic treble as well with the Rugby World Cup Sevens in certainly in South Africa. It might be Cape Town in September. So the World Series, the Com Games, and into that, it certainly, while it doesn't completely wipe away, I'm sure, the pain that they would have felt from Tokyo last year. It's been an extraordinary run and sets in, with every chance to continue later in the year. And of course, the Sydney Sevens will be back here, I think, in January, early next year. So I can't wait for that one as well.
A lot to look forward to. So anyway, bloody huge weekend of rugby, and at some point some sleep is going to need to be found. But before that, good to have spoken and caught up on what was a pretty remarkable weekend and 48 hours of rugby when you consider what's transpired. And probably the last shout out to Quade Cooper. I think that's a devastating blow for a guy that had gone so far, had so many different storylines in his life, is seemingly a changed person both on and off the field. I'd been so impressed in what I'd seen. And hopefully he continues his spirits, and fingers crossed. You wouldn't write it out, would you? The Quade Cooper story and what he's been through.
Many twists and turns.
So many. Is there one more? And hopefully we do get to see that at next year's World Cup, if indeed he can make a recovery. He's hoping.
Here. Well said, mate. That's good. That's a wrap. That's a big pod for a big weekend of sporting, of rugby action, both on and off the field. Plenty of narrative, and of course all the on-field stuff as well. Mate, thank you for your time. I'm off for a glass of red, a lie down, and hopefully a good 8 hours sleep tonight. So, mate, thanks again, and we'll talk again next week.
Look forward to it.